Welcome to Sleeping with Science. As you settle in, let your thoughts slow to the rhythm of your breathing. This story is here to guide you through the calm spaces between knowledge and rest. If sleep finds you before the end, that is perfectly fine. Your mind will keep listening in its own quiet way. And if you enjoy these journeys, consider liking and subscribing so we can share more nights of gentle discovery together. Now, let us begin with Sparks of Genius, the story of invention. Long before words or tools, there was a stillness that led to wonder. A moment when a creature paused, tilted its head, and stayed with a sight longer than instinct required. A shadow lengthened across the ground. Sparks leapt when one stone struck another. Something new stirred in that pause. Not fear, not hunger, but curiosity. It was the first flicker of invention. Curiosity turned survival into study. The hands that once grasped for safety began to test, to play, to compare. A stick became not only a weapon but a lever. Water falling from a height became more than noise. It revealed force. Each discovery fed the next, and the mind began to notice the rhythm between cause and result. The world was full of questions waiting to be asked. Observation grew into habit. The same eyes that watched prey now studied the flow of rivers and the return of seasons. Patterns appeared where once there had been only chaos. To see a pattern was to hold time in thought. It meant remembering what came before, expecting what might come after. Memory, too, was invention, a bridge between moments. Even silence taught lessons. In the hush before a storm, early minds sensed preparation. The crack of thunder offered repetition, a rule behind randomness. From such attention came control. A spark caught in dry grass became a campfire. A campfire became a gathering. Around that light, understanding began to multiply. Curiosity reshaped emotion. Fear turned into fascination. Confusion into pursuit. The same impulse that once made a creature hide now led it to observe, to reach, to try again. Each success created a small thrill, not just of safety, but of insight. That pleasure of knowing was evolution's reward for invention. The mind that wondered was also the mind that remembered. And in that loop between wondering and remembering lay the secret of progress. When someone saw smoke drift upward and thought of wind, when they watched fruit fall and wondered why, they were already inventing not objects yet, but explanations. This first flame of curiosity burned quietly but endlessly. It asked no permission and required no tools. It simply insisted on looking again, staying longer, paying attention. Every discovery that would ever follow, every spark, wheel, bridge, or thought, would trace its lineage back to that single pause. That first gaze of wonder held just a moment more than necessary. Curiosity, once awakened, never sleeps. They learned to hold a stone not only as a weapon but as a question. In the beginning, there was no word for invention, yet the gesture already existed, the testing of one thing against another to see what might happen. Hands became the first laboratories, and each bruise or spark was a note in an invisible book that the mind began to write. When one stone broke into a sharper edge, the hand remembered how it happened. Repetition turned accident into method. The earliest makers were also the first thinkers, their experiments simple but profound. What if this? What if again? The rhythm of striking and shaping carried its own kind of song. Over generations, the music of contact grew familiar. Stone taught the skin what patience felt like. Tools changed not only what people could do but how they thought. A well-shaped edge cut more cleanly, and the satisfaction of success created its own reward. The idea that effort could improve outcome was a revelation. It meant that the world could be persuaded, that chance could be guided. A tool was the first external thought, a small piece of the mind made solid. Each new creation demanded memory. Which rocks splintered best? Which angles produced a flake instead of a fracture? Learning to shape required keeping the past alive. Knowledge began to live outside the moment. The body became a storage system, its muscles recording the motions of craft long before language could preserve them. Making also brought attention to detail. The grain of stone, the weight of wood, the smoothness of a handle, all were measured not by numbers but by feel. Touch became a kind of reasoning. In that quiet concentration, a new emotion was born, pride in precision. The maker began to care not just about success but about elegance. A balanced tool, one that fit the hand perfectly, gave a sense of harmony that hinted at future art. The landscape reflected these awakenings. Valleys gleamed with flakes left behind from practice. The earth became a memory field, each shard a record of improvement. People returned to the same places to teach the same lessons. Knowledge had found geography. Soon, these objects began to carry meaning beyond their use. A blade polished until it caught the sun might be kept not for hunting but for beauty. A perfect spearhead might be offered as a gift, its symmetry admired as much as its function. Out of practicality grew ceremony. From precision, reverence. Tools also changed relationships. One could teach another to make, and that teaching created connection. A tool passed from hand to hand carried not only its edge but the lineage of every thought that had shaped it. The act of giving became the act of transferring knowledge. Invention had discovered communication long before words. At the same time, failure remained a teacher. A stone that shattered unexpectedly reminded the maker of humility. Progress was not steady but rhythmic, marked by frustration and renewal. The maker learned to begin again, and beginning again became its own kind of strength. Each tool was a small promise to the future, that tomorrow's hands would not need to start from nothing. The chipped edge and the smoothed handle whispered instructions forward through time. In that sense, the first hammer and the first blade were not inventions at all. They were messages, telling whoever found them, this worked once, try again. By turning thought into form, humanity had discovered how to make memory tangible. A tool was a conversation between generations, one that could survive even when its maker was long gone. The earth had gained a new kind of fossil, not of bone, but of idea. Invention had begun to remember itself. Fire did not begin as a discovery but as a mystery. It appeared suddenly, alive and restless, falling from the sky or bursting from trees struck by lightning. For a long time it was only to be feared, a spirit that consumed everything it touched. Yet there were always those who lingered near the edges of its glow, watching with something that was not only caution but fascination. They saw that even as it destroyed, it gave warmth, light, and protection. They began to wonder if this wild force could be persuaded to stay. The first tamers of fire were patient observers. They noticed how embers survived longer under ash, how certain woods sparked easily while others only smoked, how a breath coaxed flame while a gust killed it. What began as accident became ritual. Sparks were struck deliberately, twigs arranged carefully, and each success was met with astonishment renewed. The people who gathered around those first controlled flames were not only safer from the dark but more awake within it. The night had acquired a new center. Around the fire, the day continued. Work no longer ended with the sunset. People sat together and studied the world in its flickering light. Faces could be seen, expressions understood, thoughts shared. Speech found new rhythm in the pauses between crackles. Storytelling was born from this glow. As words and warmth mixed, imagination found a stage. The mind stretched beyond the immediate to the possible. Fire also changed the body. Cooked food softened and released its energy more easily, giving time back to thought. The flame became an alchemist, turning raw into ready, fear into fascination. The hours once spent chewing or guarding could now be used for reflection, for play, for learning. Around that same glow, tools were improved, plans were made, and bonds were formed that would outlast generations. But fire demanded respect. A spark left untended devoured fields. A careless ember could turn shelter into ruin. To live with fire was to learn balance. How much to feed, how often to stir, when to let die. In that discipline was the beginning of technology. Control without domination. The flame became a teacher of responsibility, reminding its keepers that every gift carries its opposite. Children learned to tend small fires under watchful eyes. They learned patience in the waiting, humility in the tending. Each coal that held its glow through the night was a small triumph of attention. To wake and find the hearth still warm was reassurance that the world could be managed, that chaos could be coaxed into order. Soon, fire became more than a companion. It became a symbol. People saw in it the spirit of transformation, wood to ash, cold to warmth, dark to light. They began to imitate it in their own ways, hardening clay in its heat, softening metal until it flowed like light itself. The hearth became the first laboratory, and the flame, the first instrument of invention. At its edge, thinkers saw the reflection of themselves, capable of creation and destruction, both beautiful and dangerous. Fire taught that every new power requires wisdom equal to its heat. Even today, each discovery echoes that lesson. When the last sparks faded and only smoke curled into the stars, early dreamers watched the sky and felt something stir, the sense that they too could burn brighter, that knowledge was another kind of flame. The night no longer belonged only to the wild. It belonged to thought. Before there were alphabets or maps, there was the human urge to leave a trace. It began as a line dragged through sand, a mark pressed into clay, a handprint smeared on the wall of a cave. Each gesture said the same thing. I was here, and I saw this. The maker may not have known why they did it, only that it felt necessary. A drawing outlasted the breath that created it, and that was magic enough to try again. At first, the marks were simple echoes of the world, the curve of an animal's back, the arc of a thrown spear, the spiral of a shell. To trace a shape was to study it more deeply. Observation and imagination fused into a single movement. The world could be carried inside the mind, and then placed back outside in a new form. The act was both mirror and transformation. Children learned to draw before they could speak, just as the species once had. A finger dipped in ash, a stick dragged across earth. These were the first experiments in translation. A drawing could hold a thought still, long enough for another to see it. Communication was no longer tied to sound. Vision had found its language. As the marks multiplied, they began to serve memory. Hunters used them to record paths or the cycles of herds. Healers marked herbs and wounds. Teachers used patterns to show how stars returned to the same places in the sky. Each mark carried information, but also the wonder of representation itself, the idea that reality could be copied, reduced, and revisited. The line on the wall became the earliest form of reasoning. This means that drawing changed the way people looked at the world. Once a person had drawn the outline of a tree, they could never again see a tree as just a blur of green. They saw angles, proportion, and symmetry. They saw relationships. Invention grew from that habit of attention. To see structure was to imagine change. The tools of drawing evolved alongside the ideas they served. Charcoal from the fire became a pencil, clay became a surface, color came from berries and soil. Every new material expanded imagination. A brush made from grass could capture the flow of wind. A line carved into bone could last beyond memory. What had begun as play was slowly becoming technology, and yet, even as the marks grew more precise, they remained a form of wonder. A circle drawn in the sand could stand for the sun, or for perfection, or for the promise of return. Symbols crept in, connecting the visible to the invisible. Thought was becoming layered, what was seen, what was meant, and what was hoped. Those who drew were often treated with quiet respect. They were record keepers, dreamers, perhaps magicians. To draw something before it happened was to make it possible. Before houses were built, they were traced on the ground. Before paths were cleared, they were imagined as lines joining places that did not yet touch. In that sense, every invention began as a drawing. Each line was a rehearsal for reality, a conversation between what existed and what could. Through drawing, the human mind learned to hold two worlds at once, the world that is and the world that might be. When the tide washed the sand clean, the maker simply began again. The loss did not matter, the knowing remained. From impermanence came improvement, from repetition came mastery. The marks might fade, but the idea of marking endured, and so, a simple gesture, a line in dust, a curve of ash, became the foundation of imagination. From it would rise writing, measurement, architecture, and science. Every image, every plan, every dream would trace its ancestry to that first drawing on the ground, that fragile bridge between thought and thing. The earth was no longer just a place to stand. It had become a canvas for the mind. Stone learned to rise, and the spaces of the world began to take shape beneath human hands. Shelter came first, then design. What had once been chance, a cave found or a hollow tree chosen, turned into choice. People began to stack stones, bind branches, and bend reeds not only to survive the wind but to challenge it. The act of building was both protection and declaration. This space is ours, this order is our making. At first, each structure was a lesson in failure. Walls leaned and fell, roofs collapsed beneath rain. But every mistake left a whisper of guidance for the next attempt. Builders learned that a triangle was stronger than a square, that wide foundations could carry great weight. They discovered symmetry not through theory but through necessity. Invention had moved from tool to shelter, from what fit the hand to what held the body. The world began to fill with lines and edges where before there had been only curves and chaos. Even the smallest hut carried within it the seed of geometry. A doorway was a frame for movement, a threshold between what was known and what was not. Every beam, every stone placed with intention, was an experiment in stability. As building grew more confident, so did imagination. A circle of stones became a meeting place, a ring of posts became a monument. The earth itself was shaped to echo thought. In raising walls, people learned to think in layers: what holds, what supports, what bears the strain. They were writing the first grammar of engineering, each pillar and arch a sentence in the new language of form. The builder's mind learned patience. Hours turned to days, days to seasons. The work required endurance as much as insight. It also required cooperation. One could not lift a lintel alone or set a roof beam without help. Construction created community, and community deepened invention. Shared effort made complexity possible. Shelters soon evolved into symbols. The hearth at the center of a dwelling was not just warmth but belonging. Marks carved on beams were both decoration and memory, stories told in wood and stone. In building, humanity found a mirror for its emotions, walls for safety, windows for wonder, doors for possibility. The scale of ambition grew. Some built for family, some for faith, some for time itself. The first temples and towers reached upward not only for the sky but for meaning. To raise something that would outlast a lifetime was to imagine permanence. Invention had turned spiritual, the mind asking if what it built could touch what it could not see. Even ruin taught lessons. A fallen wall revealed stress, a cracked stone told of too much weight. Builders read these signs as scientists would later read equations. The material world had become both textbook and test. Over time, the art of building changed the rhythm of living. People no longer wandered in response to seasons. They built against them. Settlement was invention turned inward. The discovery that one could design not only a tool or a shelter but a life. As dawn touched the edges of their walls, early builders might have felt the quiet pride that comes from reshaping the horizon. Their hands were rough, their designs simple, but their intention was immense. For the first time, the world around them reflected the architecture within them. They had given the landscape a memory of human thought, the idea that space itself could hold meaning. From then on, every structure, from hut to cathedral, would carry that same heartbeat, the desire to make the world steady enough for dreams to stand. When darkness returned each evening, invention did not end. It changed form. The hands that built and shaped by day surrendered their labor to the softer craft of thought. Around the fires, after food and story, minds drifted toward the horizon of sleep. In that quiet borderland, something remarkable happened. Ideas rearranged themselves. The body rested, but the imagination continued its work in secret. Night became the unseen half of discovery. The flicker of embers cast shifting patterns on walls, and people began to see meaning in those movements. Faces appeared in smoke, creatures in shadow, paths across the stars. Dreams were mistaken for messages, and perhaps they were, not from gods, but from the deep corridors of the mind itself. The day's fragments, unsolved and unspoken, gathered there and took new shapes. The mind rehearsed possibilities while the body healed. In this darkness, invention learned reflection. A builder might see a wall standing taller than any yet made. A hunter might envision a snare that moved on its own. A mother might dream of warmth that never faded. Upon waking, such visions lingered like the faint glow of ash before dawn. Some dreams were dismissed, but others were tested, and sometimes they worked. The world's first prototypes might have begun not in daylight but behind closed eyes. Sleep taught that knowledge grows not only through effort but through letting go. When consciousness loosens its grip, imagination breathes differently. The mind becomes an ocean, unbound by rules, where even the impossible may float for a moment before dissolving. From that sea rise ideas bold enough to reach daylight. As fire dimmed and stars brightened, people found themselves guided by light both outside and within. The constellations became maps, each a memory of story and direction. To look upward before sleep was to remember order in the heavens, and to wonder if such order could exist on earth. The nightly sky was the first classroom of astronomy, but also of humility. It whispered that learning was infinite, that every question opened into more. The rhythm of rest gave invention its cadence. Effort and ease, day and night, attention and release. Each depended on the other. Those who learned this rhythm created more than tools, they created balance. Even now, modern thinkers rediscover the same truth, that pause is not idleness but incubation. The first sleepers to dream of new possibilities could not have known that they were shaping a habit that would last forever. Every age of discovery would repeat their pattern: toil, rest, revelation. The pulse of progress would beat in this rhythm for millennia. When morning returned, ashes whispered beneath the fire's crust. Someone stirred them and found a spark still hiding there, ready to rise again. In that small renewal lay the lesson of all invention. What rests is not lost. It waits, transformed, until curiosity wakes once more. The night, it turned out, was not an ending but an interval, a place where ideas slept only long enough to dream themselves into being. Language arrived quietly, like a pattern hidden in sound. At first there were calls and cries, signals shared between the hunt and the storm, between danger and delight. But somewhere along the path of time, sound began to carry more than reaction. It carried intention. A tone could soothe, a rhythm could warn, a repetition could teach. The first words were not made to describe the world but to move it. They turned noise into meaning, and meaning into memory. When people learned to shape sound on purpose, invention gained its most powerful tool. A thought could now leave one mind and enter another without vanishing in between. Instructions could travel farther than a gesture. Ideas could survive without demonstration. The act of naming made the world solid. Once a thing had a name, it could be remembered, shared, compared, and improved. Language was the first network, invisible but unbreakable, connecting minds across distance and time. Around the fire, words became companions to flame. They flickered and spread, carrying stories from mouth to mouth. Each retelling polished them like river stones. In those exchanges, invention multiplied. A hunter described a new kind of snare. Another refined it. A third imagined using it for something entirely different. Collaboration was born, not from strength but from sound. The echo of speech was a tool sharper than any blade. Language also shaped emotion. A sigh could turn fear to comfort. A promise could replace force. The power once held in the arm moved into the tongue. Societies began to form around shared understanding, around agreements spoken and remembered. Trust became something that could be built with syllables. The mind learned diplomacy before it learned machinery. As words grew more precise, so did thought. To describe was to dissect. To compare was to analyze. The vocabulary of invention expanded in every direction. Stone, fire, pattern, balance, plan. Words became scaffolding for imagination. What could not be built yet could still be spoken, and once spoken, it began to seem possible. Children learned the rhythm of language before they learned its meaning, repeating the sounds that filled their world. In doing so, they mirrored the evolution of the species itself. Sound first, then sense. Repetition first, then refinement. The mind learned through mimicry, and each generation started closer to fluency. Language became storage, carrying not only facts but feelings. Songs preserved what memory might forget. Myths turned the lessons of hardship into parables that lasted. Every invention had a story, and every story preserved an invention. The tale of how fire was tamed or how the first bridge was built taught more than history. It carried technique wrapped in wonder. Storytelling became the earliest form of education. With language came imagination unbound. People began to speak of things that did not yet exist. Perfect tools, eternal lights, invisible forces. By naming the unreal, they prepared the ground for making it real. Words became blueprints of desire. The future began as conversation, but language also carried danger. Lies and misunderstandings traveled just as easily as truth. A careless word could destroy trust as quickly as a tool could save a life. Communication, like fire, needed tending. The wisdom of invention had to include restraint. Over time, language divided and diversified, becoming as varied as the landscapes it described. Yet within every dialect, every accent, the same pulse remained, the need to connect, to share thought. Even now, every whisper and every question is a continuation of that first sound that meant more than survival. When the night grew quiet and only the wind spoke through the trees, early listeners sometimes imagined the earth itself answering back. They thought the world had its own language, one they were just beginning to learn. In a way, they were right. Every discovery, every invention, would turn out to be a kind of conversation between humans and the universe that made them curious enough to speak. They had learned to speak, and now they learned to listen to matter itself. The world began to answer in metal. When humans discovered that Earth hid stones that could melt and reshape, a new chapter opened in the story of invention. The soft glow of molten bronze, the hard gleam of iron, these were not merely materials but revelations. For the first time, people realized that what seemed solid could be transformed, that permanence was an illusion waiting to yield to heat. Fire, once a companion for warmth and story, became a tool of transmutation. The first smelters crouched beside their furnaces like priests before an altar. They fed the flame with air, watched stone sweat, and saw something miraculous emerge, a new substance that obeyed their will. The discovery of metal was not only chemical but philosophical. It proved that nature's limits could bend. Bronze was the first metal to change history. It gave sharper edges, stronger tools, more efficient weapons. With it, one could cut deeper, build faster, travel farther. But it also demanded collaboration. Mining ore, controlling temperature, shaping molds, none of these could be done alone. Communities began to specialize. Knowledge fractured into crafts, and crafts wove together into civilization. Metal was the first technology that required teamwork. Iron came later, darker and more stubborn, but its strength reshaped the world. A new rhythm entered daily life, the clang of hammer and anvil, the hiss of cooling water. The blacksmith became the new thinker, part artist, part scientist. In their work was both danger and grace. The spark that leapt from the anvil was a symbol of progress itself, fleeting, bright, and born of friction. Metallurgy also changed how humans saw time. Bronze dulled, iron rusted, and from that decay came awareness of impermanence. People began to protect and maintain their tools, to plan not just for today but for seasons and generations. Repair became as valued as creation. The concept of stewardship entered invention. The mastery of metal taught precision and patience. Too much heat, and the material failed. Too little, and it resisted. The craft required observation and restraint, a partnership between human intent and natural law. From this partnership grew the foundations of science: hypothesis, experiment, and refinement. Every ingot poured was an answer tested, but the new power brought questions of responsibility. The same blade that cleared forest could cut flesh. The same plough that fed the village could serve conquest. Invention had met morality for the first time. Fire and metal together forced reflection. Progress was no longer innocent. Still, the lure of transformation was irresistible. Shaping metal was shaping destiny. The sound of hammers echoed across valleys, marking the rhythm of a species learning mastery. The earth was giving up its secrets, and humanity was listening more closely than ever. The forge became a meeting of elements: fire, earth, air, water, a reminder that invention is born from unity, not domination. Within that glow, hands and minds discovered balance. Too much control, and the metal cracked. Too little, and the shape was lost. It was the same balance invention would always need, between ambition and care, between creating and preserving. When the day's work was done, and the forge cooled to silence, the last faint heat shimmered like memory itself. The blacksmiths knew what every maker comes to know. The world is malleable only to those who watch it closely enough to learn its language. In the hiss of cooling iron, they heard the future waiting to be shaped. The idea of movement changed everything. Once, distance had been a wall, a slow and punishing teacher of patience. Then someone noticed that a round stone rolled easily down a slope, that its curve carried its weight farther than any push could. Curiosity turned the observation into play, and play turned into principle. When a log was cut evenly and set beneath a burden, the world shifted. The first wheel had been born. At first, the wheel was simple, almost accidental. It carried loads of grain or wood, easing the back-breaking weight of daily life. Yet, its logic was deeper than its purpose. The wheel taught that effort could be multiplied, that energy could be stored and released in motion. With each turn, the mind glimpsed a symmetry that felt eternal, the perfect loop of return. What moved forward also came back around. The invention spread slowly, carried not by merchants but by necessity. Carts appeared on paths that had once been worn only by feet. Axles followed, then chariots, then potters' wheels spinning clay into art. The circle became an emblem of mastery. It linked motion with creation, travel with time, utility with beauty. Every revolution of the wheel was also a revolution of thought. It made the invisible visible, the idea that the world obeyed laws of balance, friction, and momentum. Makers began to design not by guessing but by predicting. They learned that a wheel needed a center, an axis, a heart around which everything turned. In that discovery lay the seed of mechanics, astronomy, and even philosophy. To build a wheel required imagination and precision. A flawed circle stumbled, a true one glided. Carpenters learned to listen to the sound of wood as they shaped it, to sense when the arc was complete. Perfection became measurable, tangible, and repeatable. Invention had found its rhythm. The wheel changed the map of existence. It made trade possible, travel inevitable, and isolation obsolete. Villages turned into networks, regions into civilizations. With the arrival of motion came exchange, not only of goods, but of ideas. The wheel became a messenger. Its turning carried stories, languages, and dreams farther than any voice could reach. It also carried paradox. To move faster was to risk losing sight of stillness. Roads invited journeys, but they also invited conquest. Progress and peril rolled together. Humanity learned again that every invention carries both promise and shadow. Yet even knowing that, they continued, the sound of a cart rolling across stone became the soundtrack of civilization. Dust rose behind wheels like the wake of discovery. Children traced circles in the dirt. Perhaps without knowing they were drawing the oldest symbol of motion, the shape that would one day spin inside every engine and orbit every planet. The wheel taught humility too. It revealed that movement depends on balance, that progress requires something stable at its core. A wheel without an axle is chaos. The lesson outlived the object, reminding generations that the power to move comes not from endless striving, but from centeredness. As the sun set on the first roads and the last travelers reached their resting place, the tracks left behind glowed faintly in the twilight. The wheel had carved its story into the earth. It whispered to those who listened closely that everything, the moon, the seasons, the human heart, turns in circles. At first, memory lived only in voices and gestures. Knowledge was carried from mouth to mouth, fragile as breath. But voices fade, and distance distorts even the clearest sound. One day, somewhere beside a river or in the glow of a fire, someone pressed a mark into soft clay, a symbol for what could not be spoken aloud at that moment. It was small, accidental perhaps, but when the clay hardened, the idea remained. Thought had found a way to survive silence. Writing began not as poetry but as counting, marks for animals, sacks of grain, jars of oil, records of trade and promise. Yet each line, each imprint, carried more than number. It carried the seed of permanence. People realized they could speak to the future. They could say, "This happened," and make it so for all who came after. From that simple gesture grew libraries, histories, and civilizations. To write was to tame time. A word captured in clay could travel beyond death. The dead could still instruct the living. The voices of ancestors could guide builders, rulers, and dreamers. What had once vanished with breath now lingered as sign. Knowledge, once fleeting, became cumulative. The first scribes were not seen as artists but as keepers of order. They sat near fires and temples, their hands steady, their symbols meticulous. Yet in the quiet repetition of their work, they built the foundations of imagination itself. For every mark that recorded reality, another began to invent. Myths, prayers, and songs followed naturally. If words could hold truth, they could also hold wonder. Writing transformed thought as deeply as fire once had. It forced precision. A spoken story could change with every telling, but a written one demanded choice. Which detail mattered, which word deserved to last. The discipline of writing taught clarity, sequence, and responsibility. To inscribe was to decide. As scripts evolved, so did minds. Alphabets replaced pictures, ideas replaced images. Abstract thinking flourished. The written page became a mirror for reasoning, a laboratory where logic could unfold in quiet. For the first time, humans could examine their own thoughts outside themselves. The page was not just storage, it was reflection. Writing also gave rise to community beyond presence. A letter could bridge mountains, a decree could rule a kingdom, a poem could outlive its author by centuries. The written symbol turned solitude into connection. Humanity began to weave itself together in ink and pigment, but with permanence came new responsibility. Once written, a word could not easily be undone. It could be misread, misused, misunderstood. The same invention that preserved wisdom could preserve error. Knowledge had to learn humility. Each generation had to read, question, and rewrite. Still, the page endured, carrying the pulse of its creators. Every letter curved toward the next, as if drawn by the same unseen hand that once traced lines in the sand. Writing was the echo of that gesture, refined but recognizable. When the first light of morning touched the tablets and scrolls stacked beside the scribes, they glowed faintly, like embers that would never cool. In those marks, humanity had found continuity. The written spark ensured that thought could cross centuries without losing its warmth. The voice had found a way to live forever. They had learned to preserve their words, and now they began to measure their world. Writing had given thought permanence, but geometry gave it shape. Somewhere on a riverbank, perhaps in the shadow of a temple, someone noticed that a rope stretched tight between three stakes formed a perfect triangle every time. A tool of land became a tool of logic. From that discovery, the invisible structure of reality started to reveal itself. Geometry was born not in abstraction but in need. Farmers used it to divide fields, builders to raise walls that would not fall, sailors to chart stars and currents. Yet every practical act concealed something deeper, a growing belief that the universe followed rules that could be known. The world was no longer chaos, it was pattern. As minds traced lines across sand and sky, a strange beauty appeared. Numbers, once the servants of trade, became symbols of harmony. Ratios in stone echoed intervals in sound. The same proportions that built pyramids could shape melody. It was as though the universe hummed with quiet mathematics, and humans were learning to listen. The thinkers who followed those harmonies began to separate truth from opinion. They proved what they believed. They tested, calculated, refined. A straight line became not just a path but an ideal, a circle not just a wheel but a symbol of perfection. Geometry taught that clarity was its own form of grace. Temples and cities rose according to these patterns. Columns aligned with stars, courtyards matched the turning of the seasons. The act of building became an act of contemplation. Each measure and angle suggested that meaning could be found not in myth but in proportion. The mind had discovered abstraction, the ability to see beyond the visible. In geometry, invention became introspection. To measure the world was also to measure the self. The same logic that defined the shape of a bridge defined the shape of a thought. The discipline of proof and reasoning entered daily life. People began to seek certainty, not in authority, but in understanding. This quiet revolution changed more than science. It changed emotion. There was comfort in order, peace in symmetry. The endless uncertainty of survival found an answer in the certainty of form. To look upon a perfect shape was to believe, if only for a moment, that chaos could be overcome. At night, those who studied the stars drew triangles between constellations and circles around the moon. They saw movement in stillness, time in geometry. The sky itself seemed to agree with their calculations. Discovery and wonder merged into one feeling, reverence for reason. The same mind that once feared thunder was now calculating its echo. Humanity had turned curiosity into method, and method into a kind of faith. Geometry was the bridge between imagination and proof. It whispered that the universe could be trusted to make sense, and that sense could be described. That whisper would echo for thousands of years, guiding builders, artists, and dreamers alike. When the sun rose over the first measured city, light and shadow fell in equal balance along its avenues. The streets were silent, but the pattern spoke. It said what every invention has said since the beginning. There is order here, if only we learn how to see it. Sleep returned each night like a tide, pulling the body towards stillness while leaving the mind free to drift. The people who had learned to measure, build, and write still needed rest. And in that rest, something remarkable continued to unfold. The world of invention did not vanish when eyes closed. It simply changed its shape. The dream was the laboratory of the unconscious, where rules relaxed and imagination took command. No one knew how sleep worked, only that without it the mind dulled and the spirit frayed. In those ancient hours between firelight and dawn, the brain began to weave the patterns of the day into something new. Fragments of memory, an unfinished wall, a calculation, a melody merged into scenes that defied reason yet hinted at insight. A thinker might dream of walking along an endless spiral and wake with a new understanding of number. A builder might see the image of a structure floating in light and find the courage to attempt it the next morning. The dream turned reflection into rehearsal. Even before science would name it, humanity sensed that sleep was not a pause but a process. They noticed that after nights of deep rest, ideas came more easily, hands worked more steadily, tempers cooled. Sleep was invention's secret rhythm: effort, rest, renewal. The pattern repeated in everything that lived. A field needed winter, a seed needed darkness, the mind needed silence. Some believed dreams were messages, and perhaps in a way they were the brain sending reports from its hidden depths. The symbols of dreamland were not puzzles to be solved, but sketches drawn by thought in its most fluid form. In that world without consequence, fear could be faced, mistakes replayed, and desires rehearsed. The mind became its own teacher. The connection between dreaming and insight remained invisible, but its results were clear. The people who dreamed deeply created with more imagination. They trusted their visions, sensing that behind the images lay truth. Dreaming allowed risk without cost. The impossible could be tested safely, and sometimes, when morning came, the impossible no longer seemed so distant. Sleep also reminded invention of humility. No matter how bright the fire or clever the tool, there came a time when the body insisted on surrender. The wisest makers learned to honor that demand. They began to see rest, not as weakness but as partnership, the cooperation of body and mind. They noticed that creativity had a pulse, tension and release, struggle and surrender. The pause between notes was as important as the notes themselves. In the quiet before dawn, when only embers whispered, those who kept watch might see someone stir and smile in their sleep, murmuring words from another world. They would smile too, knowing that inside that resting mind, something unseen was taking shape. The next great idea might be forming at that very moment, wrapped in the gentle rhythm of breathing. Dreaming linked invention to nature's wider cycle. The ocean rested between waves, the moon disappeared before returning full. Sleep was the echo of that universal rhythm, proof that rest itself was creation. The mind did not stop, it transformed. When morning finally came, and the first pale light crept over the landscape, the world felt slightly altered. Thoughts seemed clearer, emotions steadier, the air itself new. Sleep had done its quiet work, rearranging the pieces of perception until they fit more perfectly. Every age of invention would rediscover this truth in its own way. The light of progress is born in darkness. Even now, when people close their eyes after a day of striving, they return to that ancient workshop. The dreams that unfold are the same ones that once hovered above the fires of the earliest thinkers. Night after night, the human story rewrites itself there, refining the spark that began so long ago. And so, rest remains the oldest engine of discovery, the interval that renews curiosity. For even as the body sleeps, the mind continues to wander quietly, inventing the dawn. Water spoke first, in rhythm. It carved valleys, turned stones, and taught that motion could endure without exhaustion. Early watchers noticed how a stream never tired, how wind could push waves farther than muscle ever could. Nature was filled with invisible engines, and somewhere someone wondered, could these forces work for us? The first machines were born from that thought, not from greed or haste but from admiration. A bucket on a rope, a wheel on a river, a sail catching the breath of the sky. Each was a conversation with the elements. These inventions were humble yet profound, for they marked the moment humanity stopped fighting the world and began cooperating with it. A water wheel was a miracle of patience. It needed no rest, no food, no urging. Day and night it turned, grinding grain or lifting buckets with the steady heartbeat of the stream. Its creak and splash became part of daily life, the music of utility. To watch it spin was to see the principle of labor transformed. Work could now continue without the body. Motion itself had become a servant. The windmill followed, rising like a question against the sky. Its arms turned not by effort but by faith in air. Villages grew around their shadows, each rotation a reminder that energy was everywhere, waiting to be borrowed. Farmers learned that the same gust that bent their crops could also raise their bread. Invention was learning to imitate nature's grace. These machines carried more than usefulness. They carried philosophy. They whispered that cooperation was stronger than control, that progress could come from listening as much as from commanding. In every turning wheel was the suggestion that power, to be sustainable, must flow rather than fight. The logic of the elements became the logic of invention, balance, rhythm, renewal. The mastery of motion changed how people thought about time. Once, effort was measured by exhaustion, how long a body could endure. Now, work could continue even while the maker slept. The concept of productivity emerged, along with the danger of forgetting rest. Humanity had created perpetual labor but had yet to learn perpetual harmony. Still, the sight of a mill spinning in the wind or water remained a quiet wonder. It was as though the earth had been persuaded to help. The same impulse that once tamed fire now found kinship with water and air. The four elements were no longer mysteries to fear but collaborators to trust. Children watched the wheels turn and imagined other ways to move. Pulleys that could lift stone, sails that could cross oceans, cogs that could count. The principle of transformation had taken root. Invention had found its rhythm not in struggle but in flow. These early machines were also metaphors for the mind. Ideas, too, needed balance and direction. A wheel that spun freely achieved nothing. One that met resistance achieved work. The same was true of thought. Creativity required friction, the pressure of challenge, the weight of the real. The human brain was becoming the finest engine of all. When the last mill slowed at dusk, its blades dripping with the day's labor, people listened to the water still rushing beneath it and felt gratitude. They had learned not to conquer nature, but to move with it. That lesson would echo through every age of invention. Power drawn from partnership, not domination. The stream, the wind, the flame, all spoke the same language. Humanity's task was simply to listen well enough to translate. And as night returned, the wheels slowed to silence. Yet in the minds of those who dreamed beside them, new wheels kept turning, ideas spinning in the darkness, drawing power from an endless current that needed no rest. Light had always been both comfort and mystery. It shaped the rhythm of existence, separating the hours of labor from the hours of rest. When the sun sank, life paused. When it rose, the world began again. Yet humanity never stopped wishing to keep daylight a little longer. That longing, to hold back the dark, was the quiet spark behind the next great wave of invention. At first, light came from fire alone, the torch, the ember, the flame dancing on a wick. But flame was fickle, its life measured in the patience of the one who tended it. People learned to feed it carefully, to craft oil from seeds and wax from bees, to shape glass around it, so that wind could not steal its breath. A single lamp burning in the night became more than brightness. It was persistence, the declaration that the mind would not yield to shadow. As lamps multiplied, so did imagination. Painters worked later into the night. Scholars traced letters long after the stars had risen. The light extended thought itself. To control it was to lengthen life. Candles in windows marked safety, faith, and hope. Small suns guarding against the vast unknown. The quest to hold light led to experiments with reflection. Shiny metals and polished stones were placed behind flames to amplify their glow. Mirrors taught that light could be guided, focused, even concentrated into power. It was the beginning of optics, the study of how illumination moves. People began to realize that light was not a single thing but a behavior, a conversation between source and surface. When oil gave way to gas, and gas to electricity, that ancient wish found fulfillment. For the first time, the dark could be broken not by fire but by current, invisible, clean, obedient. Night lost its absolute rule. Cities shimmered, factories hummed, and dreams that once ended at dusk now continued through the small hours. Humanity had learned to manufacture its own sunrise, yet every light brought a new kind of shadow. The brilliance of progress hid its cost, the restless hum of sleepless cities, the dimming of stars behind the haze. People discovered that even illumination requires balance. Too much light blinds, too little dulls. The mastery of brightness demanded the rediscovery of dark. Still, the emotional pull of light never faded. A child cupping a candle against the wind feels the same awe as an ancestor tending a campfire. In that fragile flame lies the promise that knowledge can outlast fear. To study light is to study the will to understand. Artists began to paint its movement, scientists to measure its speed. Both found the same truth: light reveals, but it also humbles. The more precisely it was known, the more infinite it appeared. It could bend, split, vanish, return. It behaved like matter, yet moved like thought. Perhaps that was why humans loved it so deeply. It mirrored their own complexity. Every invention since that first torch has carried light within it. The spark of a filament, the glow of a screen, the silent pulse of a satellite orbiting in night. Each is an echo of the ancient fire, refined but never forgotten. When evening settles and a lamp is turned on, there is a moment, brief, quiet, when the space fills with a familiar warmth. It is the warmth of understanding, of the long lineage of minds that refuse to sleep in darkness. And as that light spreads across the room, we remember what it means to be human, to see, to seek, and to keep the flame alive. Glass began as accident, sand fused by lightning, cooled into something that caught light and held it. Those who first found it along the shores could not have known that this fragile substance would one day open windows to worlds invisible to the eye. When the first flames of invention reached this shimmering material, humanity learned not only to shape it but to see through it, and in doing so, to see itself more clearly. At first, glass was ornament, a curiosity. It glittered like frozen water, precious and strange. But the more it was studied, the more it revealed its gift, transparency. Unlike stone or metal, glass invited light instead of blocking it. To polish it was to invite vision. Craftsmen discovered that when curved, it could distort, magnify, or concentrate what lay beyond. This distortion, once a flaw, became revelation. The first lenses appeared as experiments in curiosity, small circles of ground glass that made letters larger, faces closer. A spark of wonder followed. Perhaps the world was not as the eye believed. Through lenses, tiny creatures danced in drops of water. Mountains seemed near enough to touch. Humanity had extended its gaze beyond its natural reach. The invisible began to yield its secrets. Microscopes opened one universe, telescopes opened another. Through them, people saw both the small and the infinite. Dust turned to life, and stars turned to systems. The discoveries were dizzying. Glass, a substance once born of fire and accident, had become the tool of truth. Each lens was a keyhole through which the universe revealed its intricacy. This new seeing changed more than science, it changed imagination. Artists painted with a new precision, aware of light's subtleties. Physicians learned to look within rather than guess. Navigators steered by stars they could now study instead of worship. Knowledge grew transparent, but vision also brought humility. The more the eye could see, the less it could claim to know. Each discovery through glass revealed a greater mystery beyond it. The lens that magnified also magnified uncertainty. The observer became aware of their limits, a paradox at the heart of invention. The closer humanity looked, the more infinite reality appeared. Glass also reshaped daily life. Windows invited light indoors, breaking the boundary between shelter and sky. The dark interiors of early dwellings gave way to brightness and openness. Privacy coexisted with awareness. The world could now be seen without stepping into it. The line between inside and outside grew thinner, mirroring the boundary between idea and observation. When mirrors joined the lineage of glass, reflection took on new meaning. To see oneself clearly was both comfort and challenge. The mirror became a philosopher's tool, a reminder that discovery always includes the discoverer. In studying nature, people found themselves. Glass was fragile, yet its influence proved indestructible. It appeared in cathedrals as color and story, in laboratories as precision and focus, in every age as the meeting place between light and mind. Even today, screens and lenses carry forward its legacy, each a transparent bridge between perception and knowledge. Perhaps that is why glass continues to feel almost sacred. It is the material that teaches both openness and caution. Handle it carelessly, and it shatters. Treat it with care, and it reveals the infinite. As evening settles and light bends softly through a window pane, we are reminded of that ancient miracle, a material that lets light pass, yet holds its memory. In every reflection, every magnified drop, every gleam on the horizon, glass whispers the same quiet lesson, that clarity is not the absence of distortion, but the art of seeing truth through imperfection. Rest is the counterweight to ambition, the silent twin of invention. After each long day of chiseling, forging, and thinking, humanity learned that progress could not survive without pause. Even the brightest mind needs darkness in which to cool and reorder itself. It is in the quiet, unguarded moments between striving and sleep that understanding deepens. Ancient builders felt it first. When storms halted their work, they waited, listening to the wind against the stones they had raised. In those enforced pauses, they noticed flaws they might have missed, better ways to shape or brace the walls. Rest refined more than effort ever could. The same rhythm echoed in the lives of thinkers, artists, and healers who would come later. The mind, like a field, must lie fallow to yield again. In temples and monasteries, silence became discipline. Scholars withdrew from noise, not to escape the world but to hear it more clearly. Within stillness, ideas ripened. A monk staring at the flame of a candle or the symmetry of a leaf was performing a kind of science. Observation slowed until it became reverence. From such moments came insight that no rush could reach. Rest taught humility. It reminded inventors that they were part of the same cycles they sought to master. Muscles and minds obeyed laws as strict as gravity: stretch, release, recover. The refusal to rest was not strength but blindness. Every generation that pushed too far eventually rediscovered this truth, that even creation must inhale before it speaks again. Great discoveries often arrive disguised as idleness. A thinker drifting by a river, an astronomer gazing into nothing, a craftsman lost in the rhythm of breathing. Each seemed to have stepped away from work, yet within that stillness, connection formed. The leap between questions was made not by effort but by ease. Even nature models this balance. The tide rests between waves, the moon pauses in its waning, winter gathers itself before spring. The universe itself breathes, and invention follows that pulse. Rest is not retreat, it is return. The mind in quiet finds new patterns. It revisits familiar problems with gentler eyes and sees possibilities once hidden by urgency. The stillness of rest is like clear water. What was muddy settles, and what was unseen becomes visible. The act of doing nothing becomes the preparation for everything. In every workshop, every studio, every laboratory, there are moments when the tools must be set down. The silence that follows is not emptiness but expectation. It is the space where ideas stretch their limbs before taking form. Rest is the architecture of insight, the pause that gives structure to thought. Those who respect that rhythm endure. Their work carries the grace of patience, the steadiness of cycles honored rather than defied. The future belongs not to those who never stop, but to those who know when to stop well. Even now, in a world that glows with ceaseless light and restless invention, the same law applies. The mind's renewal comes in darkness, in quiet, in the long, slow breathing that reconnects it to life itself. In every pause lies the possibility of beginning again. As night settles and fatigue softens the sharp edges of the day, the lesson endures. Rest is not the end of motion but its origin. The stillness between two thoughts is where the next idea gathers strength. And when the morning comes, invention rises refreshed, proof that silence, too, is a form of creation. The world changed again when knowledge learned to multiply itself. For centuries, words were bound to those who spoke or wrote them. Books were copied slowly by hand, their pages precious, their reach small. Then came the machine that would turn thought into abundance, the printing press. With a single pull of a lever, one voice could now become 1,000. The quiet revolution of ink began. The first printers were artisans and alchemists in one. They mixed oils and soot, carved letters backward from memory, and pressed them onto paper with the weight of a universe shifting. The sound of a press in motion, rhythmic, steady, certain, was the heartbeat of a new age. Pages fluttered like wings, carrying words farther than wind or rumor ever could. For the first time, knowledge ceased to belong to the few. Books left monasteries and entered homes, markets, and streets. Thought became democratic. A farmer could read the words of a philosopher. A sailor could carry a poem across oceans. Humanity, once divided by distance and status, began to share a common library of dreams. The press did more than spread information, it spread responsibility. Once written, an idea could no longer vanish quietly. Truths and errors alike endured in ink. Debate sharpened, discovery accelerated, and the rhythm of progress quickened beyond recall. The very act of printing transformed thinking. It invited revision. The same machine that multiplied one idea also multiplied its challenges. In that friction, knowledge matured. Science was born in this tension. Scholars corresponded through letters and journals, testing each other's claims, refining methods, and correcting mistakes. Invention found companionship in conversation. Each discovery sparked another, forming a network of minds extending beyond geography. But the printing press also carried echoes of fire. Its power to enlighten matched only by its power to burn. Books were banned, censored, or destroyed, their words feared for their influence. Yet ideas proved more durable than paper. Once read, they lived within the reader, copied silently in thought, immune to flame. The visual beauty of print reshaped imagination. Illustrations joined text, maps grew accurate, music gained notation. The page became a stage where art and intellect performed together. A generation that once listened to stories by the fire now held them in its hands. In the scent of ink and parchment, they felt permanence. Printing also changed memory itself. Where once knowledge lived in minds, now it lived in libraries. The human brain, freed from recall, turned toward creation. To remember was less important than to interpret. The press did not diminish thought. It expanded its playground. The hum of the press never ceased. New machines rose beside rivers, their wheels powered by water and steam. The world began to pulse with the rhythm of reproduction, not of life, but of knowledge. Every revolution of a cylinder echoed the turn of an idea into reality. Each printed page was a promise that no discovery would be lost again, that wisdom could outlast mortality. And yet, amid that abundance, the same old balance remained to be kept, between learning and listening, between collecting and understanding. At night, when the last page was set to dry and the workshop fell silent, the printer might lift one sheet to the light, watching the letters glow faintly against the paper. Each curve of ink held the voice of someone long gone or not yet born. In that fragile glow, humanity could sense its new identity, a species not of strength or survival alone, but of shared words. The printing press had made thought immortal. Sound had always been present, but now humanity began to shape it with intention. Before language and writing, there had been rhythm, the steady beat of walking, the pulse of the heart, the drumming of rain on hollow wood. Somewhere in that pulse, invention found another doorway to itself. For sound was not only heard, it was felt. It moved through the air and through the body, carrying emotion before meaning. When people learned to control that vibration, they learned how to make thought sing. The first musicians were also the first engineers. They discovered that tension created tone. A string pulled taut hummed differently depending on its length and weight. Air in a reed or a hollow bone produced resonance. Stones of varying size could be struck to make scales. Every instrument began as an experiment in proportion. To play was to calculate without numbers, to measure beauty by ear. Music became the earliest model for invention's method. A melody emerged from repetition and variation, the same way progress emerges from trial and error. A note slightly altered, a rhythm slightly shifted, and something new was born. The hands of the musician mirrored the hands of the maker, guided by curiosity and guided, too, by restraint. Sound taught that freedom thrives best within structure. When people gathered to play together, cooperation deepened. Harmony demanded listening as much as leading. The player who ignored the others destroyed the song. The ensemble was invention's rehearsal, unity without uniformity. It showed that individuality could exist inside collaboration, that many could think as one without losing themselves. The world responded to these new vibrations. Songs carried news, prayer, and history across valleys. Work songs set the pace of labor. Lullabies shaped the rhythm of rest. Long before electricity or machines, people had found a way to transmit energy through air alone. Every note was a spark shared. Music also taught precision. The maker of a flute or drum needed balance, timing, and understanding of material. The same physics that ruled the turning of planets ruled the vibration of strings. Sound was invisible, yet measurable. It proved that beauty and order were not enemies. In later centuries, invention would return to sound again, in radio waves, telephones, and recordings. But those were only echoes of the first realization, that vibration connects everything. A single note can move a crowd. A single word can move the world. The power of sound is not in its loudness, but in its resonance. When people began to study music seriously, they found patterns that mirrored mathematics. Scales followed ratios, harmonies obeyed proportion. What once belonged to emotion now revealed logic. The boundary between art and science blurred, and invention walked freely across it. Even silence gained meaning. The pause between notes became as important as the notes themselves, a space for reflection, for breath, for possibility. Sound without silence was chaos. Silence without sound was emptiness. The relationship between them was balance, the same balance sought in every discovery. At night, after the instruments had stilled, echoes lingered in the air. A few fading tones seemed to hang between earth and sky, reminders that creation never truly ends. It simply changes frequency. Music was proof that invention could be felt before it was understood. It was a way to measure the invisible, to give shape to feeling and structure to time. And in the quiet after the last note, as the listeners sat in that shared hush, the lesson endured that progress, like melody, depends on harmony, rhythm, and the courage to improvise. Every age of invention, no matter how advanced, would still be guided by those same invisible vibrations that first taught humanity how to listen, how to imagine, and how to begin again. Steam began as breath, a ghost rising from boiling water, a small miracle unnoticed for centuries. But in time, someone saw not a mystery but a message. The cloud that lifted from the pot, the hiss from wet stones on fire, hinted at power waiting to be harnessed. Steam was movement made visible, the spirit of transformation itself. When the first engineers captured that spirit, the world's pulse changed forever. It began with experiments in pressure, a lid trembling on a kettle, a piston pushed by invisible force. These became revelations. Heat, it turned out, could become motion. For millennia, humanity had labored by muscle, animal, or wind. Now the elements themselves would work. The steam engine was more than a machine. It was a turning point in rhythm. The slow cadence of hand and hammer gave way to the endless beat of metal wheels and pistons. Factories rose beside rivers and rail lines, their chimneys writing new alphabets across the sky. The air filled with sound, clanging, whirring, hissing, the mechanical music of progress. What once took 100 hands could now be done by 10. The age of industry had begun, and with it, a new relationship to time. Work no longer followed the sun. It followed the machine. Days lengthened under lamps, nights shortened by noise. The clock became both tool and tyrant. For the first time, invention outran rest. Production replaced patience, efficiency replaced rhythm. Yet within that fevered pace lay new opportunities. Metalworkers, machinists, and dreamers turned steam's pulse into precision. The craft of invention became the science of engineering. The first trains appeared like creatures from myth, iron animals breathing smoke and light. They joined towns, then cities, then continents. Distance shrank. A journey that once took weeks could be made in hours. The world, once vast and slow, became smaller and faster. Steam had folded geography into a single fabric, but as with every gift, power carried a shadow. The same engines that wove prosperity also darkened skies. Forests vanished into fuel, rivers thickened with waste, and people learned that progress, if unbalanced, could consume the very world it sought to improve. Industry revealed both humanity's genius and its capacity for blindness. Still, within the smoke and motion, there was wonder. Children watched locomotives thunder past, hearts echoing their rhythm. The sight of steel in motion stirred something ancient, the awe of control, the thrill of movement, the dream of mastery. The sound of a whistle in the distance was more than a call to travel. It was the promise that the impossible could be made to move. Steam did not end with trains or factories. It was a principle, not a period. Energy transformed, invisible power made practical. It paved the way for every future engine, from turbines to rockets. The idea that heat could become work was the beginning of modern physics itself, the bridge from mechanics to energy, from fire to electricity. In every hiss of vapor and turn of the wheel was the echo of that first discovery. That change is motion, and motion is life. Humanity had captured its own reflection in machinery. Restlessness turned into rhythm, curiosity condensed into force. When dusk fell over the cities of smoke and soot, and the last trains rumbled home, the air shimmered with a faint silver haze. It was the breath of progress, still rising, still restless, still dreaming of where it might go next. Steam had given the world a heartbeat loud enough to be heard by every generation that followed. And though its rhythm would one day soften into quieter engines, its lesson would remain. Power lies not in fire alone, but in the courage to set that fire in motion. Electricity began as curiosity, a faint spark leaping from fur to metal, a shock that startled more than it hurt. People called it magic, the playful trick of nature. But where most saw surprise, a few saw invitation. The spark seemed alive, a living thread of energy that might one day be woven into the fabric of civilization itself. The early experiments were small, almost childish. Amber rubbed with cloth, a frog's leg twitching under a charged wire. Yet those flickers hinted at a hidden force flowing through everything: stone, air, flesh, and cloud. Scientists began to chase it, building strange devices that hummed and crackled, trying to catch lightning in their hands. They learned that electricity was not chaos but pattern, not wrath but rhythm. Then came the age of discovery. A metal rod under a stormy sky proved that lightning and electricity were the same. The heavens could be studied, not just feared. Generators followed, turning motion into current, current into light. For the first time, power could travel without weight, work without flame, move without sound. The invisible had become obedient. Cities transformed. Lamps that once flickered with oil now burned steady and bright. Wires stretched from rooftops like the veins of a new organism, pulsing with promise. The nights grew shorter, the world more awake. Street lamps turned darkness into opportunity. Factories never slept. Homes glowed like constellations brought to earth. Humanity had captured the sun and taught it to serve at will. Communication followed light. The telegraph's pulses carried words across continents faster than birds could fly. Voices traveled through wires. Images would soon follow. Thought had found a new speed. The mind, once bound to distance, could now leap from city to city in an instant. The globe began to hum with connection, a chorus of electricity linking strangers through signal and sound. Electric power changed more than industry. It changed imagination. If invisible forces could be tamed, perhaps other mysteries could too. Inventors began to think in networks, in flows and circuits, seeing the world as a vast system of energy waiting to be organized. They built machines that imitated the human nervous system, wires as nerves, switches as synapses. The dream of artificial thought had its spark here, in the gentle glow of early filaments. Yet even as it brightened cities, electricity deepened contrasts. The poor still worked in shadow while the wealthy dined under chandeliers of light. Power, both literal and social, revealed its inequality. Invention's gift remained double-edged, illumination for some, blindness for others. The question of how to share progress became as urgent as the progress itself. Still, the wonder endured. A light switch became a gesture of divinity, darkness banished by a fingertip. The child who turned it on for the first time felt what the first firemaker must have felt: awe, mastery, and the faint fear of what such control might mean. The world had entered an age of brightness that never fully dimmed again. Even in the deepest night, somewhere, a light remained. The stars above had been joined by the lights below, and the line between heaven and earth had blurred. Electricity reminded invention of its true nature: connection. Every circuit required flow, every bulb depended on its unseen network. The lesson was simple yet profound: nothing shines alone. And so, beneath the endless hum of power lines and the quiet buzz of lamps, the world learned to live in a constant twilight, half natural, half made. In that glow, humanity saw its reflection, radiant, restless, and still reaching for the next invisible spark that would light its way forward. The world that glowed with electricity soon longed to move faster. Steam had brought strength, but it was slow. Iron wheels obeyed rails, not will. The spark that powered lamps whispered another promise: motion without fire, speed without exhaustion. The age of engines had begun to hum, but electricity turned that hum into song. The first electric motors were small, fragile things, coils and magnets spinning like toys. Yet within their turning lay the seed of an empire. They showed that power could flow endlessly, that movement could be born not of explosion but of attraction and repulsion, of invisible forces dancing in perfect rhythm. For the first time, motion could be created without muscle, steam, or wind. Humanity had found a new pulse, cleaner and quieter than any before. This revolution began in workshops lit by the very energy it sought to control. Inventors wound copper wire around iron cores, watching the strange miracle of magnetism come alive. A flick of current, a sudden spin, the same principle that pulled a compass north now drove a wheel. What had once guided sailors would soon drive cities. Factories replaced their roaring steam engines with humming dynamos. Belts turned smoother, production steadier, air cleaner. The mechanical age softened into something more elegant, almost graceful. The rhythm of progress no longer clanked or hissed, it whirred. Electric motion changed how people moved through space and time. Streetcars appeared, gliding through cities with effortless precision. Elevators rose in smooth silence, lifting entire skylines. The electric train extended daylight itself, connecting distant towns in a single journey. Even the bicycle, reborn with a motor, hinted at a future where distance would no longer dictate destiny. At home, motion entered domestic life. Sewing machines, washing drums, and fans turned quietly, transforming labor into leisure. The electric age did not only expand strength, it redefined rest. People could now use energy as easily as breath, flipping a switch to summon motion from stillness. It was power without burden, at least, for a time. The mastery of movement inspired deeper questions. If electricity could move wheels, could it also move minds? Engineers dreamed of machines that might think, calculate, even remember. The motor's turning became a metaphor for cognition. Energy made intelligent through pattern. The line between physical invention and mental possibility began to blur. But like all inventions, the electric age revealed both brilliance and cost. The wires that connected also divided. Those who had light and motion lived differently from those still waiting in darkness. Every city's glow was mirrored by distant smoke from the coal that fed it. Humanity was learning, again, that no power comes without price. Still, the fascination was irresistible. The sight of light and movement combined, trams gliding under a canopy of glowing lamps, felt like a dream materialized. Electricity had woven itself into the rhythm of modern life, so seamlessly that people forgot it was still a miracle. And yet, beneath the beauty, the same principle endured. Motion depends on connection. A single broken wire could stop an entire city. Progress, it seemed, required not only invention but maintenance, attention, balance, care. The first engineers of electric motion worked not only with tools but with faith. They trusted invisible laws, unseen yet certain, to guide their creations. Every rotation of a motor was a quiet act of belief in order, proof that energy, properly understood, could serve purpose rather than chaos. When the day ended and the machines were switched off, the silence that followed was strangely alive. The air still hummed faintly, as if memory itself held a charge. Humanity had crossed another threshold. Movement, powered by thought, thought, powered by light. The future, though unseen, vibrated close, like the pause before the next surge of current. And somewhere, in the dim glow of an electric bulb, an inventor looked at a spinning motor and realized it was not just a machine, but a metaphor. Proof that the world could move endlessly as long as curiosity kept the current alive. The more the world moved, the smaller it became. Once, oceans had divided civilizations, their depths a barrier between minds. Now, waves carried signals. The same invisible electricity that lit the streets began to bridge continents. The dream of instant communication, once belonging to poets and prophets, had become a project of engineers. Humanity was learning to speak in lightning. The telegraph was the first voice of this new era, a code of dots and dashes that crossed deserts and seas. A message that once took weeks could now arrive in minutes, stripped of sound yet full of urgency. The world's pulse had quickened. Behind every rhythmic click was the birth of a global mind, one thought connecting to another, forming patterns too vast for any single person to see. Soon the telephone followed, carrying not symbols but voices. A whisper could cross mountains, a farewell could travel through rain. For the first time, distance lost its dominance over intimacy. A mother could speak to her son across an ocean. A scientist could share discovery the moment it was made. Connection became the new form of power. Cities began to hum with wires, stretched like veins through the air. Every street buzzed faintly with the conversation of thousands. The planet itself seemed alive, wrapped in a nervous system of copper and current. People called it progress, but it was more than that. It was the beginning of collective awareness. The telegraph and telephone altered not only communication but perception. Time itself began to flatten. What had been far away became right now. The world's vastness folded inward, and with it came both wonder and unease. The pace of information outgrew the pace of understanding. The challenge of the future would not be speed, but meaning. The first voices carried over wires were met with disbelief. "It is as if the dead speak," someone said. Indeed, it felt like summoning spirits, invisible, immediate, intimate. Yet soon it became ordinary, as every miracle eventually does. People began to measure silence by the absence of signal. Then came radio, communication without wire, voice without tether. The air itself became a highway for thought. Families gathered around wooden boxes to hear distant news, orchestras, and stories. The world had found its collective campfire again, burning not with flame but with frequency. Words and music traveled faster than light once seemed to. Broadcasting gave invention a new heartbeat. Ideas spread like weather, invisible, unstoppable. Revolutions began with whispers transmitted over static. Hope traveled at the speed of sound. For the first time, humanity could share experience in real time. A song played in one place could make strangers weep in another. The world had learned to feel together, but connection also carried noise. Truth and error shared the same wavelength. The same air that carried comfort could also carry fear. The gift of instant reach demanded discernment, and that lesson, even now, remains unfinished. Yet despite confusion, wonder prevailed. The invisible nature of communication became a metaphor for all invention, proof that unseen forces could shape reality. The lines between presence and absence blurred. The voice that traveled through air without body hinted at possibilities still beyond imagination. Wireless thought, digital dreams, minds joined by code. Late at night, when static hissed softly between stations, listeners sometimes felt as though the world itself was breathing. Billions of voices moving through a single medium, speaking, listening, learning. The age of communication had begun not with volume, but with vibration, a pulse of electricity carrying the oldest human desire, to be heard, to be understood, to belong. And as the planet glowed with the faint signals of its own creation, humanity had never been more connected or more challenged to listen deeply. For every message sent was also a question, echoing through the wires and waves. Now that we can speak to everyone, what shall we say? The machines that once carried sound soon began to capture sight. For centuries, artists had chased the dream of preserving light, of holding a moment still long enough to share it beyond memory. Painters worked in oil and shadow, their hands guided by patience and imagination. But one day, invention caught the reflection itself. The first photograph was not only an image, it was a memory made physical, a negotiation between time and technology. At first, it was chemistry that performed the miracle. Silver crystals on glass, soot on paper, light trapped and fixed by alchemy. The process was slow, delicate, almost reverent. Subjects had to stand still for minutes, breathing shallowly as the unseen lens drank in their presence. Yet when the plate was developed and the face appeared, a perfect likeness staring back, the world gasped. Humanity had built a mirror that remembered. Photography democratized vision. The privilege of portraiture, once reserved for kings and the wealthy, now reached farmers, sailors, and children. Every life could leave a trace. Families held their own histories in hand, no longer fading with memory. The camera turned moments into artifacts, and with it, the sense of time itself began to change. People no longer only lived their days, they collected them. But the true revolution lay in what photography revealed about perception. It showed that reality was subjective, that framing, focus, and timing could transform truth. Two photographers could stand in the same place and tell entirely different stories. The invention of the camera did not just document the world, it questioned it. Seeing became interpretation. Soon, stillness was not enough. If a photograph could hold a single moment, perhaps many could hold motion. The moving image emerged from this desire, a sequence of photographs, each one whispering to the next, until illusion became rhythm, and rhythm became film. The first audiences watched trains rush toward them on a screen and leapt back in fear. Reality had learned to replay itself. Cinema became the new language of dreams. Light flickered across darkened rooms, and entire lives unfolded in minutes. The camera no longer simply recorded, it imagined. Storytellers became engineers of emotion, using angles, shadows, and silence to shape what hearts would feel. Film united art, science, and empathy. It proved that invention could do more than change the world's tools, it could change its soul. The motion picture captured not just movement, but mood. It turned memory into melody, reality into reflection. People began to see their own lives as stories, their struggles as scenes, their triumphs as endings worthy of applause. The cinema taught humanity how to view itself, not as chaos, but as narrative. But the power to capture truth also brought the power to distort it. Images could be arranged, moments edited, meanings reversed. The same technology that revealed the world could also disguise it. Invention had once again extended both truth and temptation. The eye had to learn discernment as the ear once had with sound. Yet the miracle remained undeniable. For the first time in history, light itself had memory. The sun's reflection could be replayed at will, carrying laughter and loss across generations. A child could see the smile of a grandparent long after their voice was gone. The lens taught humanity humility, to look closer, to question what it sees, to find wonder in the ordinary. Every photograph, every film, was a reminder that existence itself is fragile and fleeting, but beauty endures in its echo. When the projector's reel slowed and the final image lingered on the screen, the audience sat in silence, illuminated by the glow of invention. They had seen not only the world outside them, but the imagination within them. Light had learned to remember, and in doing so, it had taught humanity how to see itself anew. The inventions that captured light soon turned their gaze inward. After conquering the visible world, humanity began to wonder about the invisible one, the realm within flesh and thought. What made the heart beat? What pattern of matter allowed a mind to dream? The curiosity that once shaped fire and glass now turned to biology, to the machinery of life itself. At first, the study of the body was an act of courage. To open it was to question mystery, to risk the sacred. Yet curiosity overruled fear. Healers became observers, then scientists. They noticed that the body, like every invention before it, followed patterns, pressure, rhythm, balance, exchange. Blood flowed like rivers, nerves sparked like lightning, muscles coiled like springs. Humanity realized that it had been living inside a masterpiece of engineering all along. Microscopes revealed what the naked eye could never see. A drop of blood teemed with life, a cell divided with quiet precision, tissues danced to hidden rhythms. Each new discovery deepened both wonder and humility. The body was not a single invention, but an orchestra of them, a network so intricate that even the smallest imbalance could undo harmony. The age of anatomy gave way to the age of medicine. Knowledge of structure turned to knowledge of healing. Herbs became chemistry. Observation became diagnosis. The same logic that built bridges now repaired hearts. Each illness studied was a doorway to understanding resilience. Then came the greatest revelation, the code within. Under microscopes finer still, scientists discovered that life carried instructions, spirals of information written not in ink but in molecules. DNA was the blueprint of existence, the language that told cells how to grow, divide, remember. Humanity had found the library of life, hidden within itself. This discovery changed not only medicine but philosophy. For centuries, people had asked what separated them from the world they studied. Now they saw connection. The code of a human echoed the code of a leaf, a whale, a bird. The boundary between self and nature blurred. The universe was not a collection of objects, but a continuity of patterns. With this understanding came both power and peril. The ability to read life's code invited the temptation to rewrite it. Scientists learned to alter genes, to cure diseases, to design crops that could resist famine. Yet each step forward required deeper reflection. To modify creation was to inherit responsibility once reserved for myth. The study of the body also returned invention to empathy. Healers rediscovered that progress without compassion becomes harm. Machines could measure heartbeat and brainwave, but only kindness could restore meaning. The art of medicine remained as vital as the science of it. The hand on the shoulder, the voice that said, "You are not alone." Hospitals became temples of collaboration, chemists, engineers, and caregivers working as one. The stethoscope and the scalpel stood beside microscopes and computers. Every heartbeat they studied was both data and miracle. The same electricity that powered cities now powered hearts, literal sparks of life sustained by human hands. In learning the mechanisms of life, humanity did not lose its mystery. It deepened it. The closer scientists looked, the more intricate existence became. A single cell held more complexity than a city, and within it, a memory of all that had come before. Each discovery in biology echoed the earliest lesson of invention, that life itself is the ultimate engineer, perfecting through patience what no hand could design in haste. The mind that questioned nature was, after all, nature questioning itself. As the lights dimmed in laboratories and the hum of machines softened, one truth lingered in the silence, the realization that every heartbeat, every breath, every spark of thought was both mechanism and miracle. In the mirror of biology, humanity saw not mastery but belonging, a reminder that the greatest invention was the one that had been beating inside all along. The mind, having explored the body and the world, turned next to itself. The greatest frontier of invention was not in stone, steam, or steel, but in thought. What was intelligence? What caused imagination to ignite, memory to return, emotion to sway? For centuries, philosophers had asked these questions in silence. Now scientists began to ask them with instruments. The age of understanding consciousness had begun. At first, the study of the mind resembled the study of stars, observation from afar. Behavior was charted like constellations, predictable in some patterns, chaotic in others. Psychologists mapped the landscape of thought, naming its rivers and storms. They learned that emotion was not weakness but signal, that memory was not archive but construction. Each new insight dissolved an old illusion. The invention of machines that could measure the mind's faint electricity changed everything. The brain, once a metaphor, became a field of data, sparks dancing between billions of cells. Every idea, every fear, every dream was accompanied by movement, rhythm, chemistry. The organ that had invented the telescope and microscope was now turning its gaze inward. What scientists saw was humbling, complexity beyond comprehension. The brain was not a single engine but an ecosystem, capable of both logic and poetry. It learned through failure, adapted through pain, and rewired itself after loss. Intelligence, it turned out, was not structure but story, a continuous rewriting of experience. As humanity studied thought, it began to mimic it. The first computers were born from the dream of replicating reasoning. Wires and circuits stood in for neurons and synapses. At first they only counted, following commands with precision but no curiosity. Yet each improvement brought them closer to reflection. Could a machine one day think? The question was no longer fantasy, it was design. Artificial intelligence became the mirror through which the mind examined itself. To build a machine that could learn forced people to ask what learning truly meant. Was intelligence pattern recognition, prediction, imagination? As algorithms improved, the boundaries blurred. Machines translated languages, composed music, painted images, and diagnosed illness, yet they did not feel. Humanity realized that emotion was not the opposite of reason, but its companion, the compass that gave meaning to calculation. Still, curiosity pressed forward. Data networks spread like neurons across the planet, connecting billions of minds into a single system of exchange. Each search, message, and memory became a pulse in this digital brain. The world was inventing a reflection of its own consciousness, vast, restless, and hungry to understand itself. But knowledge without wisdom risked imbalance. Just as fire needed tending and electricity needed restraint, the new intelligence required guidance. The challenge of the modern age was no longer how to create, but how to coexist, how to ensure that the machines humanity built amplified its best instincts rather than its worst. The mirror of invention showed both faces at once, the capacity for wonder and the temptation toward control. In every laboratory and classroom, a quiet question grew. What if awareness itself was the ultimate invention? Not built, but awakened, an emergent property of complexity, a flame born from friction. The same spark that once lit the first fire now flickered in the circuits of code. Humanity saw itself reflected in silicon and wondered whether this, too, was evolution's design. And yet, amid all the algorithms and machines, the oldest truths remained. A kind word still healed, a story still inspired, silence still taught. Technology might extend perception, but wisdom still resided in empathy. The hum of servers sounded almost organic, a heartbeat of collective thought. The line between human and invention had grown thin, but beneath it all lay the same rhythm, curiosity reaching outward, reflection turning inward, creation and consciousness feeding one another in endless loop. The mind, it turned out, was both inventor and invention, the tool and the wonder it pursued. And as it studied itself, it began to sense that perhaps every great discovery, from fire to thought itself, had been the universe learning to remember its own light. The more deeply humanity understood its own mind, the more it began to dream beyond it. Once, invention had sought to master the physical world. Now, it sought to transcend it. Machines had given people power, speed, and knowledge, but there remained a quiet yearning to go farther than the horizon, higher than the clouds, deeper than imagination itself. The next frontier was the heavens. For millennia, the stars had been both compass and mystery. Sailors steered by their patterns, poets wrote of their silence, and dreamers imagined stepping among them. The telescope had already turned eyes into instruments, revealing that the night sky was not a ceiling but an ocean. Yet even knowing this, it seemed unreachable, until invention learned to overcome gravity. It began with flight. A bird's effortless glide had long mocked human limitation. Wings of cloth and wood came first, trembling and fragile. Many failed, but failure was only another form of curiosity. The first sustained flight, brief as a breath, changed everything. In that moment, the earth released its hold, and the air became territory. Humanity had gained a new dimension. Aviation soon turned from marvel to method. Within decades, the sky filled with trails of progress, biplanes, airships, gliders, jets. Distance once measured in days now passed in hours. The world's vastness shrank again, folded into the blue. But even as the horizon curved beneath them, pilots looked upward still, to where the blue faded into black. The dream of space was born from that upward glance. The same physics that had lifted kites now aimed to lift entire civilizations. Rockets were the next expression of fire, not warmth this time, but propulsion. A flame harnessed and focused so precisely it could break the bonds of the planet itself. When the first rocket rose, trembling and magnificent, it carried more than metal. It carried every question humanity had ever asked. In space, invention found both triumph and perspective. The sight of Earth, small, delicate, glowing with oceans and light, altered consciousness itself. Borders dissolved in that view. Humanity, for all its conflict, appeared united, fragile, and extraordinary. Astronauts spoke of awe, of silence, of the humbling realization that invention was not conquest but connection. The technologies born from the space age reached far beyond the stars. Satellites turned the sky into a web of communication. Images from orbit revealed the shape of weather, the scars of deforestation, the beauty of cloud and sea. Humanity's reach had become planetary. The sky was no longer a limit but a mirror, reflecting both ambition and consequence. The effort to reach beyond also deepened understanding within. To send life into the void required precision, cooperation, and faith. Each launch was an act of unity. Engineers, mathematicians, machinists, and dreamers working toward one shared ascent. The rocket became not just a vehicle, but a symbol of collaboration, proof that invention could unite as powerfully as it could divide. Still, the deeper into space humanity looked, the more it felt a familiar pull, not of gravity, but of humility. The vastness defied ownership. Every discovery led to another mystery. Black holes, invisible matter, expanding space. The more science explained, the greater the unknown became. The cosmos remained a teacher, patient and infinite. Now, satellites circle above like silent thoughts, telescopes drift beyond planets, and machines whisper across the void, carrying our questions farther than any voice has gone. Yet even in this immensity, invention returns to its source, wonder. The same spark that once drew people to the campfire now draws them toward distant stars. Fire had become flight, and flight had become freedom. Humanity had learned that the universe is not apart from us. It is our origin, our mirror, and our destination. And as night falls across the earth, and the first stars appear above electric cities, a quiet truth remains. Every spark of genius, every act of invention, is a small echo of the cosmos remembering itself. As humanity looked to the stars, it also began to look beneath the surface of its own creation. The age of invention had built an astonishing world, glowing cities, flying machines, instantaneous communication, yet beneath the hum of progress came a whisper of unease. The question that now lingered was not what could be made, but what should be made. For the first time, progress began to examine its shadow. Machines had freed hands but trapped hours. Energy had illuminated homes but darkened skies. Technology, once the servant of wonder, risked becoming its distraction. The same mind that had dreamed of creation now felt the weight of consequence. It was the birth of reflection, invention turning its gaze inward. Scientists, philosophers, and citizens alike began to ask, could growth be guided by wisdom, not only by capability? Could invention serve not just speed, but meaning? The answers would define the next era of human thought. The earliest environmentalists, long before the word existed, were those who simply looked around and saw imbalance. Rivers that once ran clear now carried the color of industry. Forests thinned, air thickened. The planet that had given invention its materials began to show its fatigue. Humanity was learning a hard truth, that the cost of mastery could be the loss of harmony. But recognition sparked resolve. If ingenuity could build machines of destruction, it could also build systems of repair. Solar panels caught light the way leaves had done for eons. Wind turbines echoed the rhythm of ancient mills. Science returned to listening, learning again from nature rather than merely extracting from it. The new inventors saw sustainability not as limitation, but as elegance, the art of creation that replenishes what it consumes. Parallel to this awakening grew another realization. Connection was not only mechanical, but moral. The same wires that carried power could also carry empathy. Information could unite as easily as it divided, if guided by intention. Global networks began to link not just markets, but minds. Knowledge, once confined by language and geography, became a shared landscape. A student in one hemisphere could learn from a teacher in another, both lit by the same soft glow of a screen. Yet the digital age also revealed new kinds of fragility. The mind, overwhelmed by constant input, risked forgetting how to rest, how to wonder in silence. The challenge was no longer access to knowledge, but depth of understanding. Invention had to rediscover rhythm, the balance between speed and stillness, noise and meaning. Artists and thinkers began to remind the world of this balance. They used technology to create moments of reflection, music composed by algorithms, architecture powered by sunlight, stories told through immersive light. The most advanced inventions began to imitate nature's grace: self-healing materials, recyclable design, energy drawn from breath and motion. Progress had begun to fold back into poetry. The lesson of this new age was subtle but profound. The future would belong not to those who conquered, but to those who harmonized. Invention was no longer a race, but a dialogue between human and planet, between machine and mind. At night, in cities glowing softly beneath satellites, a strange serenity returned. The lights that once screamed of dominance now whispered of responsibility. People looked up again, not with pride alone but with gratitude. They began to see that every discovery, fire, wheel, light, code, had been a form of remembering. Humanity was not separate from creation. It was creation becoming conscious of itself. And so the story of invention matured from noise to nuance, from speed to balance. Progress had found its reflection. The spark that once lit a cave now illuminated an entire world, and in that light humanity finally saw what it had been seeking all along: not power, but harmony. The story of invention had always been told in motion, each discovery propelling the next. Yet as the centuries turned, humanity began to realize that the greatest power lay not in speed, but in synthesis. The countless sparks of genius scattered across history began to converge, forming constellations of understanding. It was no longer enough to invent in fragments. The world itself demanded coherence. This new era began quietly, in laboratories and classrooms, where disciplines once divided began to merge. Biologists spoke with engineers, physicists with artists, designers with philosophers. The boundaries that had once kept knowledge tidy began to dissolve, revealing the truth that all invention was part of one long conversation. The same curiosity that shaped fire also shaped flight, and the same rhythm that guided music guided mathematics. Everything was pattern, and humanity was learning to see it whole. Technology, once driven by utility, began to serve imagination again. Computers no longer merely calculated, they composed. Algorithms painted landscapes, built symphonies, and simulated life itself. At first, this provoked fear, a sense that creation was being handed to machines. But gradually, a subtler realization emerged. These machines were not rivals but reflections. They amplified human creativity rather than replacing it. The collaboration between mind and mechanism became the next form of genius. Artificial intelligence, born from circuits and code, began to write poetry, solve diseases, and predict storms. It helped humanity see connections too vast for a single brain to perceive: ecosystems, economies, emotions, all intertwined in fragile balance. The new inventors were not conquerors but caretakers, learning to navigate complexity with humility. They understood that true progress did not mean domination of nature, but participation in it. Amid this interconnection, a new kind of wisdom surfaced: the awareness that invention carries responsibility not just for outcomes, but for meaning. Every technology, no matter how advanced, still answered the same question asked by those first firemakers: what will this make of us? The world responded by turning innovation toward empathy. Cities were redesigned for people rather than traffic. Healthcare became as much about comfort as cure. Data, once used to predict behavior, began to protect dignity. The most powerful machines in history were now serving the oldest purpose: to make life gentler, more livable, more human. Still, the search for balance continued. For every new breakthrough, there was the quiet reminder of its shadow: the risk of overreach, the temptation of control. Yet each generation seemed to grow a little wiser, carrying forward not only the brilliance of invention but the humility of reflection. The wheel had turned many times, and now it began to move inward, toward understanding rather than expansion. In classrooms glowing with digital light, children learned about galaxies and genomes in the same breath. They were taught that every equation, every code, every creation was a form of participation in something greater. They would grow into a world where invention was not spectacle but stewardship, a harmony between insight and care. The hum of the planet had changed. Satellites whispered data to oceans. Wind turbines sang with the air. Cities glowed like constellations of intention. Humanity had filled the world with mirrors, not to admire itself, but to remember. For invention, at its heart, had never been about machines or mastery. It was about the impulse to understand, to bring light into darkness, form into chaos, connection into isolation. Every breakthrough had been a way of asking the same question in new languages. How do we belong to this universe? And in the quiet that followed progress, as the machines rested and the stars looked down unchanged, a deeper realization dawned that perhaps the story of invention was not humanity's alone. It was the universe continuing its own act of creation, through the only instrument capable of recognizing it, a conscious mind. As invention matured, humanity entered an age not defined by what it could make, but by what it could understand. Knowledge had expanded into every corner of existence, from the depths of the ocean to the edges of the observable universe. Yet the more the world was known, the more profound its mystery became. Discovery no longer felt like conquest. It began to feel like listening. Science and spirituality, long seen as opposites, began to recognize each other's reflection. Both sought truth, both studied pattern, both knelt, in their own ways, before the infinite. The microscope and the telescope revealed the same symmetry, fractals repeating from cell to galaxy, order nested within chaos. The language of mathematics became indistinguishable from poetry. Equations describe not only what is, but what is possible. Invention began to serve wisdom, instead of replacing it. Technologies that once consumed attention now extended awareness. Artificial intelligence helped decode the behavior of ecosystems, restoring forests and cleaning oceans. Machines modeled the planet's climate like a living organism, showing humanity not only its fragility, but its resilience. The planet, long treated as a resource, was finally recognized as a collaborator, an intricate system that had always been inventing itself. The more humanity learned to live in rhythm with nature, the clearer its purpose became. Progress was no longer measured by speed or power, but by balance, by how gracefully intelligence could move within the flow of life. Energy came from sunlight, architecture breathed with air, and cities grew like gardens. Invention had come full circle, imitating the effortless sophistication of the natural world that inspired it. The concept of genius itself evolved. It was no longer the solitary spark in a single mind, but a collective glow shared across billions of interconnected thinkers. Each discovery, each innovation, each creative act contributed to an expanding web of insight. Humanity had become a distributed intelligence, learning together, dreaming together. The age of isolated brilliance had given way to the age of shared consciousness. Education, too, transformed. Children were taught not only how to think, but how to wonder. They learned that understanding the world meant belonging to it, that every field, science, art, ethics, emotion, was part of one vast continuum. Knowledge was not a ladder to climb, but a circle to enter. Amid all this integration, the oldest questions remained. What is consciousness? Why does awareness exist at all? The same curiosity that had lit the first fire now turned inward again, this time toward the very spark of being. Some saw consciousness as an emergent property of complexity. Others saw it as the foundation of the universe, the field through which matter and meaning intertwine. Perhaps, they thought, invention itself was the universe awakening to its own nature. And yet, for all the magnificence of progress, the heart of invention remained deeply human. The desire to protect, to connect, to comfort, these were still the roots of every breakthrough. A new medicine, a new poem, a new way to speak to the stars, all were gestures of care. As evening settled on a planet alive with gentle light, humanity stood at a rare moment of stillness. The tools that once divided had begun to unite. The technologies that once conquered had begun to heal. Invention had finally learned empathy. From the glow of a single campfire to the shimmer of satellites orbiting far above, the story had always been the same. the same spark, traveling through time, changing shape but never purpose. It was the spark of curiosity, of connection, of creation itself. And as people looked up at the night sky, their first and oldest inspiration, they understood something both humbling and profound. They were not outside the universe, trying to master it. They were the universe, continuing its own act of invention, forever learning how to see itself in the light. In the end, the story of invention circles back to where it began, to a spark in the dark. From the first flame drawn from stone to the quiet pulse of light in distant orbit, the same impulse has guided every discovery, the wish to understand, to connect, to endure. What began as survival became curiosity. What began as curiosity became creation. And what began as creation became meaning. Humanity's journey was never just about building tools. It was about learning to become one with the act of creation itself. Each generation inherited that spark, shaping it into what the age required. Fire turned to metal, metal to motion, motion to light, and light to knowledge. Every invention was both a question and an answer, a way to ask what it meant to be alive. And though the forms changed, the essence never did. The spark remained the same, restless, luminous, infinite in potential. As the 21st century unfolded, invention began to slow in appearance but deepen in intention. No longer a race for dominance, it became a practice of harmony. Machines learned to sense emotion, medicine learned to anticipate illness, art learned to respond to the heartbeats of its audience. The walls between disciplines continued to dissolve, until invention itself became a living system, as organic as thought, as fluid as water. In this quiet synthesis, humanity rediscovered what the ancients already knew, that all creation begins in observation. To invent is to listen to the world, to the body, to the whisper of ideas as they form. The mind that observes deeply does not conquer, it collaborates. Progress, it turned out, was not the opposite of peace, but its extension. Science evolved into stewardship. Technology became transparent, woven into the background of life, like light through glass. People no longer marveled at machines, they marveled at the calm their inventions allowed. The tools of the age were invisible, but their effects profound. Food enough for all, energy drawn from the rhythm of the earth, communication free of barrier or bias. Humanity had built not a world of machines, but a world of flow. And yet, even in that quiet perfection, the oldest truth endured. Invention was never about arrival. The spark that drives creation is eternal precisely because it never rests. Each generation would find new mysteries to uncover, new patterns to perceive, new ways to translate wonder into form. The story was not ending, it was simply evolving beyond language. Philosophers of the new era described humanity not as a species of builders, but as a species of translators, interpreters of the universe's hidden code. Every discovery was a translation of reality into awareness, a bridge between what exists and what is understood. Through this lens, invention became not a product of intellect, but of awe. At night, when the world quieted and the cities dimmed their lights to see the stars again, people could trace their story written across the sky. Each constellation marked a moment of transformation. The fire, the wheel, the compass, the code. Each spark mirrored the one that lived within them. They had reached the stars not through domination, but through understanding. And in that vast silence, filled with the hum of distant galaxies, humanity remembered why it had begun this journey in the first place, not to escape the dark, but to illuminate it, to kindle the unknown, not to destroy it. The spark of genius was never the property of a few, it was the birthright of all who dared to wonder. It lived in every discovery, every question, every act of compassion that turned knowledge into wisdom. And so, as the story of invention folded into the story of consciousness itself, a final truth emerged, that creation is not something humans do, it is something the universe is, dreaming through them, endlessly becoming, endlessly aware. We from Sleeping with Science thank you for joining this long journey, a journey through fire, through thought, through time, and we wish you a good night.